Greetings, political refugees currently in Thailand in a prison cell somewhere. I am Patrick Smith. This is Disenthrall. Today we have a special guest. Today we have a special guest, Matt Sands, who is an advocate for Nations of Sanity, a would-be movement looking to create a free society, voluntarism, by establishing the NAP as the law, or terms of peace, through a three-part peace agreement. In addition to writing articles for the website, which explain and explore the implications of establishing the NAP as a universal law, he is also currently making video content for the Nations of Sanity YouTube channel. We'll have links to all this in the description below, while he searches for either scrutiny or support for what he thinks is the only way to create a truly free society where everyone can have equal rights and freedom. Welcome to the show, Matt.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate you taking the time to speak about this.
Yeah, so let's just kind of get to know you first a little bit. Where are you from? Who are you? How's things going?
I'm from South England. Just kind of an average working guy. I'm 37 with have a young boy, Marley, yeah, I don't really know what else to say about me, really. I'm not overly interesting, but I think the movement that I'm advocating is, and the ideas behind it. And I'm just sort of quite passionately involved in pushing that. So,
well, I don't know if you did this on purpose, but the light behind your head gives you kind of a halo effect. So it's kind of a religious discussion that we're going to have here today, I think.
It's fully intentional.
Are you, or what would you label yourself as politically? Let's start there.
I go for voluntarist.
Voluntarist.
I like that. I think that, yeah.
And how did you sort of come to arrive at that position?
Well, I kind of feel that I was, in a way, always a voluntarist in my heart before I knew the term and before I was familiar with the non-aggression principle as a term. I kind of came across the principle of the non-aggression principle as a term through Stefan Molyneux, actually. And basically sort of started learning about the non-aggression principle itself. I mean, the thing about the non-aggression principle is I think it's something that everybody, when I explain to other people, they're like, oh, yeah, don't harm others, don't initiate force on people. It's kind of a common sense thing, I think. So when I first came across this principle, it wasn't like a new concept for me. It was just the term that I was unfamiliar with. And that sort of got me in the road of exploring it more, looking at libertarianism, then anarchism, and eventually sort of arriving and settling on voluntarism and deciding, yep, that's what I'm about, voluntarism. So pretty much the same as anarchism in my mind. But
the Molyneux kind of started you on that journey. I've been calling him Molyneux, yes, for reasons.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, he's taken a big nosedive, in my opinion, and I'm not a fan anymore. But I do have to credit him for being the person that first sort of turned me on to the conversation. I think it's a shame that he has sort of gone the way he's gone. But yeah, he's certainly the one who sort of turned me on to the conversation, got me involved with understanding the sort of arguments that are being made about taxation being theft and stuff like that, which is self-evident when you think about it, but it's just not something that I'd thought a lot about, prior to being exposed to these ideas, I suppose. But as I say, in a way, I was always a voluntarist because I always, again, it seems like lessons that I learned when I was like 4 or 5 years old about, don't steal, don't hit, don't, if someone hurts you or hurting someone else, then you can use force, but otherwise you should be leaving people alone. And that was a pretty simple lesson that I learned at a pretty simple time. And I remember when I first started learning about things that were laws, obviously in my country, in the UK, but, all around the world. And the first thing that struck me was every time I came across a law that was, like a victimless crime kind of law, like a drug law or a gambling law or anything like that, it always completely befuddled me. I never understood how someone can be a criminal when they're not hurting anybody. It just baffled me. And I've always kind of had the attitude that that's what the law should be. If you're not hurting anyone, then you're not committing a crime and you should be left alone. And then when I came across the whole idea of the non-aggression principle and sort of listened to people like Molyneux who were talking about taxation being theft and the implications on government, and it just became a logical progression. Everything sort of fell into place from there. Yes, the non-aggression principle, yes, that's pretty objective. That's a universal principle or universalizable principle. And once you do apply that, then no one can deny that taxation is theft. A lot of people will try to argue that it's necessary or whatever, but the principle stands firm. The same goes for government as a ruling entity or any kind of ruling entity, if it's monarchs or governments or criminal mafia, it doesn't really matter. They're all kind of the same. And yeah, I mean, that's basically the journey I went on. It was really about just coming across this principle, which already spoke to something I felt like I believed anyway, and just applying it, consistently. And when you do that, everything sort of falls into place as you go along, I find.
I agree. And my path included the Wallanu as well. And you have to give credit where it's due. Otherwise, you're not being honest and genuine. It's just annoying that I have to add a caveat to that every time I bring it up. Yeah, Molyneux's got some great stuff back in the day, but watch out for that new stuff. That new stuff's a little shady. Yeah. So, so I wanted to kind of really quickly talk about how we met, because I think it's important, because I think the conversations where should I start? So this platform is beginning to grow. Thankfully, it's awesome. And one of the effects of that growth that I have found is that people start contacting me for conversations. They want to talk about things. They want to give me feedback, which I love and appreciate. And they want to challenge me when they think I've got something wrong, which I appreciate even more when it's polite. You were one of the people that contacted me after a show that I think you saw with, who was the show that you saw? What was the first one?
It was the one with Walter Block and Victor Pross.
The recent Walter Block. Okay, yeah, got it. Yeah. So
yeah.
You contacted me to talk about this idea that you have, this Nations of Sanity concept that you're working on, and wanted to talk it over. And so we started going back and forth on Facebook, and then that evolved into a voice conversation that was like an hour and a half long. It was amazing. It was great on our Discord server. For those that aren't aware, we have a Discord server where you can have some amazing conversations with like-minded people. And one guy that calls himself a commie that's actually so confused about communism that he's a capitalist. It's kind of fun. You can play with him. But the point is, this platform and these conversations are important because they forward our ideas. And I get disparaged and I get talked down about for challenging other people on their ideas, calling them out when I think they're wrong, correcting them when I think they're wrong, and trying to engage in battles of ideas, I guess is what I'm saying. To go out of your way, to spend some of your human lifespan fighting about and pushing back and forth and figuring out and clarifying and refining these ideas, I think is one of the most noble things you can do. So I wanted to thank you for being one of the people that were interested in doing that, and that were interested in doing it in a non-trollish, genuine way. So I've enjoyed our conversation so far. Got that out of the way.
Me too, and I appreciated you taking the time to have that conversation, and I appreciate even more you taking the time to speak to me on your show now. Same as you, I love having these conversations. I love thrashing through the ideas and the principles, and where there are areas where people are disagreeing, it's good to hear both sides of it. You want to be challenged on the things you believe in, because it helps you if you still believe it afterwards, and you've taken an honest approach to criticisms and scrutiny that you've had, then it just reaffirms that you're on the right track because you've taken that criticism. One of the little metaphors I use with regards to my Nations of Sanity thing is, it's like, if I build a vase that I think's indestructible, I want to invite people to come and try and hit it with a hammer, because I think it's indestructible. And if I'm wrong, I want to be proven wrong. And if I'm right, I want to be proven right. And I want people to see that this is as strong as I say it is. So it's important to have these conversations. Thank you.
Yeah. And if you secretly don't believe it is as strong as you say it is, you will not invite people to challenge it. You will shy away from conflict over those ideas. So it's a marker of confidence that you look for challenge. I understand that completely. The last thing I want to do, quick plug, because we've got a new, before we get into the Nations of Sanity, we got a new t-shirt store up with some I guess custom unique designs. We have our Feminism is Cancer design. Let's see if you can see that. Proud of that one. We also have the ubiquitous taxation is theft, and we have a
Always a classic.
make Orwell fiction again, which I think is fun. So check out our store. Link will be in the description for that as well if you want to support the show. We only make a few bucks on your purchases, but it's still kind of cool swag. So that's it. Now let's talk about Nations of Sanity. I want to start with, because not very few people are motivated to work on this thing that you're working on. Very few people are motivated are interested in this problem, because it is a problem. So why don't you start by describing the problem you're trying to solve? How about that?
Okay, yeah. I mean, basically, most anarchists, certainly anarcho-capitalists and voluntarists, are pretty united with regards to the non-aggression principle. We all can agree and understand that it's an objective principle that, I mean, I say that it basically defines crime. It doesn't cover all good and bad. I mean, I have my own subjective morality that doesn't cover everything. You know, basically you can still disagree with things that aren't violations of the non-aggression principle on a more subjective level, but the non-aggression principle kind of draws that line with regards to what's actually a crime when you're actually violating somebody else. And once I come to the realization that the non-aggression principle, you know, was an objective definition for crime, then for me, the obvious next step is, well, then that should be the law, a law that applies to everybody. And the only way to have a law without a ruling government, because you obviously can't have a ruling government because that would be a violation of the non-aggression principle itself. So the only other way you can establish a law without a ruling entity of any kind is to establish it as the terms of peace for a peace agreement. So that was the sort of next logical step. Is, okay, we need this to be the terms of peace. But then, as great as that works and as clear and objective as the non-aggression principle itself is, there was still two additional dimensions that needed to be agreed in practicality. So if we were going to establish the non-aggression principle, then we need to obviously agree to do that. And that's agreeing to have the non-aggression principle be the law. But then there's two other things that people need to agree on, which are kind of self-evident from the non-aggression principle, but I still think they need to be set and declared so everybody knows ahead of time. And that is why the peace agreement that the Nations of Sanity proposes is a three-part agreement. And the three parts go, part one is just the agreement. So that's to establish the non-aggression principle as the law. And at that point, everyone needs to understand what the non-aggression principle is. And then if they all agree to establish that as law through a peace agreement, then that's great. Then part two is what I call the lines in the sand. And that's basically about drawing the lines that set certain parameters where there could be differing interpretations. And then part three is about rightful ownership. Just to go back to part two quickly, just to clarify what part two is, because this is one area that I know you sort of scrutinized when we spoke before. It's not defining necessarily precise standards. It's basically saying, just to I'll give a couple examples if I can. Let's say, for example, the non-aggression principle says that any competent adult has full self-ownership and full self-autonomy, the moral agency. They're responsible for their actions, and they also have the right to make their own decisions concerning themselves. They can, consent to sex, drugs, and engage in contracts. We also understand that children can't do these things. They'd still be protected by the NAP with regards to harm or loss, but they don't have the ability to consent to legal contracts, certainly can't consent to sex, and can't consent to taking drugs. And they would have and they're also not responsible for themselves. I would argue they wouldn't be criminally responsible for things they did. They would have a guardian, usually their parent, that would obviously take that responsibility for them until they come of an age where they can take full responsibility, and that's when they take full freedom. I think the non-aggression principle makes that clear, but what it doesn't make clear, and this is where part two is exactly when a vulnerable child becomes a consenting adult. And although reasonable people can disagree to a certain extent with regards to that, I do think there's like a limit. The reason I use the age of consent for my first example is because it involves numbers if you're talking about age. I think I'd just like to add one caveat that if you were going to have an age of consent, it would probably, in addition to age, it would probably also include like a competency standard as well, because obviously there are some adults that would be like childlike with regards to being mentally handicapped or something like that. And we already recognise this standard in today's world with people that aren't fit to stand trial, for example, because they're not considered mentally, they're not considered to have their faculties or whatever. And that's the same reason why we would exclude children from such things. So the non-aggression principle makes that clear, but it doesn't set the exact standards of, and reasonable people could disagree over maybe like an 18-year-old or a 19-year-old or something like that, again, with competency tests added. But there's got to be a limit to how much you could agree to disagree. So let's just say, for example, in this peace agreement with regards to age of consent, everyone said, okay, well, people can agree to disagree and have their own little societies that have different age of consents that they all are voluntarily a part of, and those rules would only apply to people that are voluntarily a part of it. But there's also a limit of tolerance that's got to apply to everybody. And let's say, for example, it was like 14 to 21, just for argument's sake. I'm not saying that would be the range, but let's just say that was the range that we said was like internationally acceptable, or universally acceptable, or however you want to put it. And what we're basically saying then would be, if people say, well, we don't really want to associate people that would consider a 16-year-old to be an adult, we think it's 18 and we wouldn't want to associate with people like that, and they can have their own little societies where they don't, but we're not going to make war against people that have the age limit there. However, if they go below a certain point, then we would use force, because then that's when we feel like the non-aggression principle is being violated. And then just to move away from age of consent, just to show there are other examples. Like I say, I only use that because I think it's easier to visualize with the numbers.
Let me interrupt you, because the question was just like a high level, like, what are you trying to work on?
Sorry.
No, that's fine. We can get it.
We went down a rabbit hole.
I wanted to spiral down, not just like dive in the middle. It's all good.
Sorry, yeah.
So I'm curious, like, no, you're good. What drives you to work on this problem of how society or a community could organize and regulate itself? Like, where does your inner drive come from that makes you motivated to work on this?
Well, basically, I guess I look at the world and see it as a kind of criminal, insane mess in many ways, with the risk of sounding negative. I mean, obviously, there's lots of great things about the world, and there's lots of great things about the society we live in. I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I do see our society as fundamentally rotten to the core with regards to the principles that govern it. And I obviously want a solution for that. And I suppose it's just the way I guess the way I looked at it was, people are so divided over so many different things, and a lot of those things I don't think you could unite people on. I think in many ways, I think it's right that people should be divided on a lot of things. We have different sensibilities and we have different cultural preferences and what have you, but there is a certain common ground that all good, decent people should have, and that is what I think the non-aggression principle represents. As I say, I think it defines crime. So we can still want to disassociate with people that we don't share common values with to a certain extent. But I think there needs to be a line where we all agree what is and isn't a crime. Because the reason why that line's important is because that's when you use force. And the other thing that I suppose I was looking at was the fact that I see so much criminality and so many criminals getting away with their crimes. And I think a big reason for that is because the whole notion of crime has been completely perverted and distorted and to the point of almost losing all meaning. And that's what I think's kind of at the core of what's wrong. I think so many other problems stem from that. Whether it's government corruption. Okay, well, government corruption's inevitable, because when you have the power to rule, we all know about that saying about power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Well, what's the solution to that? Remove that power. No one should have the right to rule anyway. Again, obvious violation of the non-aggression principle. And I'm thinking, well, we don't all need to be. And the problem is whenever I've spoken to other people about that, they immediately go to, oh, well, we'll just have anarchy and everyone will be robbing and raping and looting and all the rest of it. And it's like, well, no, hang on a minute. You can still stop people from doing all of that without ruling them. It's not like either we have totalitarian rule or it's just a mad, lawless free-for-all. We can actually have one law built on this perfectly objective principle. And the beauty of the non-aggression principle as well is you can enforce it without violating it, without initiating force, because all violations of the non-aggression principle are by definition an initiation of force. So any force used to stop that is by definition an act of defense. So to have the non-aggression principle as law, especially if it's established as a peace agreement rather than, through an authority, which it can't be anyway because a ruling authority would itself be illegal under the non-aggression principle. If you have that, then you've basically got a law that everybody can enforce with it, has equal rights to. I'm not saying everyone has the equal ability to enforce it, and people will want to delegate that, but we should all have the same rights to.
Well, a ruling authority that behaved only according to the non-aggression principle would not be ruling or an authority. It would just be some sort of, voluntary security company or service, right? So
exactly.
And that's the beauty of the non-aggression principle, is that because it's universalizable, meaning that all people, and that's important to define, meaning that all people in all places across all of time, across the entire universe, across all species, can hold that as their central moral principle at the same time, in all times, all places, and there be zero conflict of interest there. That's the beauty and the power of the raw non-aggression principle, which is what you call your step one or number principle one, or what did you had three, right? In the Nations of Sanity, what was that?
Basically it's just three parts.
Three parts.
Part one is just agreeing to the principle. Yeah, part one is just agreeing to the principle, and then part two and three are just about defining that practically so everyone knows where they stand ahead of time. I mean, I still think the principle governs part two and three. Like, for example, with part three that's about green rightful ownership, that's still got to be dictated by the non-aggression principle. And you could argue that the non-aggression principle makes it self-evident. And for the most part, I would agree with that. But I still think it needs to be declared ahead of time. Otherwise, people will just say, well, I don't interpret the non-aggression principle that way. Or I think, you'll get the commies saying that I don't recognize property because now you're making production out of it and now it's MO, and all this sort of stuff. That's why I just think we need to draw these lines ahead of time. And the two lines that need to be drawn is the rightful ownership is obvious because, property rights is all well and good, but if I don't agree that you own your house, then it doesn't mean much. And as I say, part two is almost like, it's kind of like part three, but for everything that's not directly related to property, really.
I would say that the non-aggression principle is like a ghost. It's without material existence, without property rights. I would almost put an understanding of what property is, the concept of property, as number one, because you can't even understand or apply the non-aggression principle without first understanding the property. That would be my first piece of feedback, is I would put the property as number one, because the NAP is like a meaningless gibberish without an understanding of property, because property defines what aggression is and, whether or not somebody has attacked you or damaged you. It literally defines what is considered an initiation of force. So you have to I think that's a prerequisite. And then the second thing, let me just get one more point and then I'll kick it back to you. The second thing, again, the beauty of the non-aggression principle, because it's a universalizable negative obligation to not do something, to not damage other people's property, to not violate other people's consent. That is an expectation that you can put on everyone without their explicit agreement to abide by the non-aggression principle. Because it is merely a negative obligation, that's without that limitation of it only being a negative obligation, it would not be universalizable. Another way of saying that is you can't put that expectation on everyone around you without getting their consent. It's like taxes, for example. That is an obligation put on everyone around us without their consent. That makes it immoral. So the beauty of the NAP is because it's a negative obligation, you can have that expectation of other people without their consent. So I'm on board with your number one. I'm definitely, I think your number three, the what I would consider the simplified or neo-Lockean property, first use property norm, is part and parcel of the NAP, is a prerequisite for it. It's your number two that we spent an hour and a half talking about previously, and we can go ahead and get in that. Do you want to respond to anything I said before we move on?
Yeah, well, just to say, I mean, one, I do agree with you about the non-aggression principle, and the idea of this peace agreement is, I mean, when people say, oh, how many people need to agree to that, I'm like, just enough to establish it as law. Not everyone has to agree to it. It would still apply to everybody because it's the non-aggression principle. And like you say, it's the one thing about that principle because it is a negative thing. As I say, the whole part about the part 2 and 3, and
what does sorry could you I've caught you saying this a couple times, so if you could clarify it, it might make the rest of what you're saying make sense. When you say establish it as law, what does that mean? Because there's no state. What does that mean?
Well, that's why I also say sometimes the terms of peace, because basically I want us to create a peace agreement which we use to, for want of a better word, overthrow all the ruling powers. That, like, so for example, rather than, like, say you had an anarchist who wanted to get everybody to vote to get rid of the government, I'd say, well, that's not really good enough, because that's kind of like getting rid of a particular slave master without abolishing slavery. So the idea of establishing the non-aggression principle as law through a peace agreement is it's kind of like, to use that metaphor, it's kind of like, rather than just removing the slave owners, actually abolish slavery and do it in the form of a peace agreement. So we're all basically saying, right, these are the terms of peace between all people. We're all united in the understanding. Again, not all of us.
Said,
some people,
yeah, I was going to say between all people. If everyone signed up to abide by the NAP, then we have a wonderful world, problem solved. No more conflict. We're done. Explain how because it won't be all people. Explain what you mean by that.
People.
Like, yeah.
Okay. Well, when I say all people, I mean it will apply to all people. So even people that say, I don't agree to the NAP, it's like, well, it doesn't matter. We're still going to use force on you if you violate it.
Well,
so
then it's not an agreement.
That's what I mean by.
Then it's not an agreement.
It's an agreement. It's an agreement between all the people that want to establish it as the law. Like, it's basically a way of uniting us all, because it's like, rather than saying, like, let's put it this way. Say you had a bunch of people that wanted to unite because they say there's just too much murder going on. We all want to unite and be on the same page that we want to get rid of murder. And then other people say, well, we want to get rid of robbery because there's too much theft going on. It's like, I'm just saying, well, let's put it all together. We all want to get rid of crimes. And so let's all get on the same page of what a crime is. Non-aggression principle defines it. Okay, now let's all agree to have that be the terms of peace that we all, and when I say we all agree, all the people that are going to get together to make this happen are agreeing. So it's not everybody that's agreeing. I guess what I'm saying is if I had the power to enforce the non-aggression principle, some super alien race came down and said, Matt, we like what you're saying, and we've got all the super technology we want, so we can, stop anyone that tries to stop you, and we'll enforce that for you. That would be great, but that ain't going to happen. So the next option is to try to get everybody I can to sort of jump on the same page. I feel
that was the qualifier I was looking for.
People.
Yeah, that was the qualifier I was looking for. Get everybody I can. So that means
yeah.
That it makes it reasonable because you're not expecting everybody in the world to agree with that. And so it also, let me try and define it from the other direction, and you can tell me if I'm wrong. So nations of sanity would be a concept by which a community could organize itself around. And the people that chose to be part of that community would agree to these rules, and the people that didn't choose to agree to be part of that community would not have the rules subjected upon them.
No, that's not what I'm. No,
without your number two. Now, sorry to interrupt. Without your number two, that would be how it is, right?
Well, I suppose. Well, it wouldn't necessarily be that without number two, but there might be certain areas where I feel like where there is kind of grey areas over interpretations on, like I say, specific parameters, then I feel people, if you don't have a line saying, well, this is the limit, how far you can stretch that interpretation, I think people could push it to absurdity. So, I mean, just to quickly go on to the age of consent thing, if you didn't have a line saying, okay, well, you can have a different society where you're declaring people adults at 16, and we'll have our society where we're declaring them 18, and we don't really agree with you, so we don't want to associate with you, but we're not going to make war with you. But if you go below 14 or 12 or wherever the line is drawn at, then we will go to war with you, because then you're paedophiles or whatever you are, that, you're violating the non-aggression principle. Then we're saying you're definitely violating the non-aggression principle. Do you see I guess what I'm trying to say is the principle itself doesn't have grey areas. As a principle, it's black and white. But where to draw certain lines isn't always 100% self-evident. I mean, me and you also were having a little bit of disagreement about the doorbell bomb analogy, and actually one of the things that helped me realize when I was thinking about that, because I did see where you were coming from, and even though I was like, but it could be seen as a trap, although I understand where you're coming from is, they're on their own property. If they didn't invite anybody onto their property, so I did see where you're coming from. But then I realized, okay, even if I fully agreed with you that the doorbell bomb wasn't a violation of the non-aggression principle, and depending on the caveats you add, I would agree on certain aspects. Like, for example, if the doorbell was on the outer perimeter of someone's property so that someone could push it without even entering the property, I think that's definitely a violation of non-aggression principle.
Not everybody might have seen that video, so just for quick context.
Sorry.
No, for quick context, we had some people in our Discord server. Join that if you want. The link's in the description. They were challenged. I put the challenge to them to design, the most absurd, complicated ethical scenario that they could think of to try and test our application of the non-aggression principle, which is kind of a little bit what we're doing here today. And an early version was a doorbell bomb. That was an early situation that we discussed. So you own your property, you own your house, and you choose with your property to build a bomb into your doorbell. Is that a violation of the non-aggression principle if somebody walks on your property, rings it, and blows himself up? I'll put the link in the description to that video as well. But I wanted to talk about the clarifications that you think are necessary or needed for the non-aggression principle. So, just because
to touch back on that, because it relates. Sorry, cool.
Yeah, I wanted to briefly, not completely blow past the age of consent discussion. I don't like the age of consent discussion, and I rarely talk about it in public because people are more rational about bigotry and racism and abortion than they are about age of consent. Like, it is almost impossible to have a genuine discussion on that without wild accusations, dangerously wild accusations being thrown around. So I don't want to get too far into it. But just because we haven't yet figured out the objective, universalizable application of the non-aggression principle in a situation is not evidence that there isn't such a determination. It's not evidence of absence, is what I'm saying. So we just need to do the work to figure out exactly who the non-aggression principle or what entities the non-aggression principle applies to, and at what point certain rules do or do not apply. If it even, what I'm saying is there is an objective answer, a black and white answer to every single ethical question that I've ever seen. And I have yet to be proven wrong in that regard. And yes, I've been challenged with the age of consent before. We just need to figure out what the objective definition is. Just because a lot of work hasn't been done in that area, probably because it's so sensitive, doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And the reason why I'm shying away from and resisting your number two, which is your clarifications, correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't want to misquote you, I don't want to straw man you, but it feels like your number two are clarifications of the non-aggression principle that we will force on everyone else, whether or not they agree to them. How about that? Can we?
Well, that is what it is. Yeah, I mean, the whole peace agreement, part 1, 2, and 3, is all based on that. Yeah, that will be forced on everybody, regardless of whether they agree, with the same justification that we've already laid out for being able to force the non-aggression principle itself on people. And as I say, I just consider part 2 and part 3 just ways of defining that. Just to use, I mean, I can give other examples outside of age and consent. The only reason I use it is because
let's stay here just for a second. I would ask you, what makes the non-aggression principle something that you can apply or force on other people without their consent? Because whatever that thing is, your number two has to also have that. Because if it doesn't, you can't do that.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, basically, what it is because by definition, violating the non-aggression principle is an act of aggression against somebody else. So the non-aggression principle prohibits the initiation of force, but it doesn't prohibit the use of force, across the board, as you know, and I'm sure most of your viewers are well aware of this. So you can enforce the non-aggression principle without violating it. There's no contradiction in using force to enforce the non-aggression principle, as we've already said, because it is an act of defense by definition, simply because all violations of the non-aggression principle are an act of aggression. Therefore, any attempt to enforce the non-aggression principle is by definition an act of defense. The reason why part 2 still falls into that is because it's just drawing the line where I guess what I'm saying is like, there's certain areas, and I do agree with you that there probably is an objective answer, but as you say, we don't know the objective lines in all these cases. So where we don't know the objective lines, we might need to draw 2 lines that sort of mark out separate the grey area from the black and white, and mark out our limits of tolerance with regards to different interpretations. So,
but you're using the royal hour, not the individual hour, when you say that. Like when you leave the objective answer, you also leave behind the ability to force it on other people, and you enter the realm of our group of individuals' opinions about where the 2 lines should be, which means you also lose the ability to enforce those 2 lines on other people.
Well, I understand what you're saying, but I guess from my point of view I'm saying that there's instances where you're definitely violating the non-aggression principle, and then there's instances where you're definitely not. But I do think, not in all areas, but in certain aspects, with age of consent being a potential one, where it's hard to draw one line that everyone can agree on, where there's no sort of subjective debate. Like I say, you said it yourself, the non-aggression principle, there may be an objective line to be drawn, but we can't necessarily do that. And even if we can draw that line, that's what part 2 is about. It's like just to use that quickly, that doorbell example, it's like, even if I completely agreed with you about the doorbell, and that's where the line needs to be drawn to allow for doorbell bombs, my point is that needs to be declared ahead of time. That needs to be part of this peace agreement. Everyone agreeing on the non-aggression principle won't make things like that self-evident. Even if it is in your mind because the principle makes it clear, we still need to declare it, I think. I just think it's just really about just clarifying the non-aggression principle just that little bit, and just, as I say, just drawing those lines where, I mean, just to give you one other quick example, and I can use the abortion example, actually, because, again, the whole problem with the abortion thing, it isn't about whether killing babies is wrong. Of course it is. It isn't about whether a woman has the right to decide what she does with her body. Of course she does. It's the whole conflict of the 2 thing. And it's also about people disagreeing at what age that child becomes a human, in the sense that it has that it needs that protection. And what I'm saying is part 2 is about drawing that line. The non-aggression principle clearly says that a sentient being has certain rights not to be harmed, but it also says that if you're not a sentient being, then that doesn't apply. So it makes the principles always clear. I just think part 2 is about drawing the line, and it would do it for the abortion thing. It would draw a line and say, okay. And again, this line might still not meet with everybody's exact approval. You might have some people saying, well, I still don't want to associate with people that don't have. But this is the line where, because if you cross this line, then you're violating the non-aggression principle, because we deem this child to be of an age where it does need to be protected. However many, I mean, I'm not a doctor, so I don't know exactly what the stage is, and it wouldn't be something that I'd personally decide, and it was something that people would need to, have evidence and all the rest of it. But I just think it's just things like that.
Let's take abortion, and let's stay on this issue, because it's what you're using your number 2 to do is to control for the continuum problems, the problems that most people would understand to currently have a correct answer between this outer parameter and this lower parameter. We're not sure where it is yet, but it's somewhere between these 2. Abortion is probably the most contemporary example of that of a continuum problem like that, right? So we know that killing a baby outside of the womb is immoral, and well, some people would argue that if it's a couple cells that have just stuck on, have just grown together, that it is acceptable to end that life. I have done the work in this specific continuum problem to try and find the objective application of the non-aggression principle, and that endeavor led me to realize that there isn't some things built into the NAP that are needed to interpret the NAP, is what I'm trying to say. So this is the first time I've talked about this, so I apologize if I'm stumbling through it, but there are two fundamental questions about what we would consider rights. And we talked about this before, and I'll bring them up here for the people watching. What are rights? Basically, what is the NAP is another way of saying that. What is the NAP? And who does it apply to? What entities on the planet does it apply to? Answering these two questions clarifies a whole lot of the continuum problems that most people run into. The challenge is to answer these questions in a universalizable way, in an objectively universalizable way, so that they can have that same negative obligation, universalizable power that the non-aggression principle does. Something that is objective and clear and can be applied across all time and space the same way and not create conflict. Or not create unjustified conflict is a more precise way of saying that, right? So what is the NAP? What are rights? I would say that the non-aggression principle, the rights are a mutual understanding between sentient beings. And I have to define sentience when I get into that, because the Webster's definition of sentience is not quite what I'm intending. I say that sentience is, there's two parts to what sentience is. One is the ability to think in terms of concepts instead of, individual objects. Like, I understand, this is a perfect example, actually. This is a plastic 3D printed pistol. And I know that it's a pistol because I have the capacity to understand concepts. The concept that is pistol. I don't have to, like when I first saw my pistol, my actual pistol, and somebody said, "Oh, that's a pistol, Patrick," and I learned, okay, this object is a pistol. And then later I saw this one, and I'm like, well, what is this? That is what an animal would do. They wouldn't necessarily recognize these two objects as the same concept, called a pistol. So the ability to think in terms of concepts is the first part. The second part is the ability to choose a future state for your life, like choose a goal for yourself amongst a list of possible goals, and then choose a path that best will help you to achieve that future state, that future goal for yourself. So the ability to plan and determine your actions, and the ability to think in terms of concepts, I think, are what I call sentience, and what I say is required to answer the second important question, which is who gets rights? Who does the non-aggression principle, what entities does the non-aggression principle apply to? It applies to everybody that has the capacity to understand it, is a simplified way of saying it. Everyone that has the capacity to understand what rights are and to plan ahead for their actions, to choose goals and to plan and control their own actions in the world, is an entity which you should have the expectation of them respecting your rights and afford them the respect of you not aggressing against them. So the answers to those questions solve the continuation problem of abortion in a lot of ways. So sorry, I'm talking around this issue because I haven't done the abortion topic yet, and I've been wanting to plan this video out. I'm kind of excited about it. So what are rights? Rights are a mutual understanding between sentient beings. So the non-aggression principle is a mutual understanding, a reciprocal understanding between sentient beings, based on my definition of sentience. The NAP applies to, or said a better way, you can apply the NAP onto anyone that is or will be sentient. And that's an important distinction, is or will be, because there are a lot of situations in which you're temporarily not sentient, you're not sentient yet, you will be sentient in the future. And so we generally have an understanding amongst ourselves, again, this is a mutual reciprocal understanding, that we don't cease to be property owners when we're asleep or in a coma or not currently in a state of conscious or of sentience that we will one day achieve, which applies to embryos as well. So my answers to these questions, my application of these questions to the non-aggression principle, I've worked hard, and this is, again, I'm putting this out there to be challenged, just like you're putting out your ideas to be challenged. But this is a path to achieving a universalizable answer to a continuum problem. And I'm saying until you do the work to find that answer to a continuum problem like this, you don't have the logical, I don't want to say authority, but you don't have the power of logic behind your attempt to force that on other people. So I talked for a long time.
Okay,
What do you think about that?
Well, I've got a few things. I mean, the part about that that defining is kind of what I'm getting at with my part two, because I suppose where I'm getting at is with part one, people are just agreeing to the principle, and the principle itself needs to be defined at that point for them to agree to it. But it's this that you're talking about is what I think part two is about. It's when you find that answer, declare it, draw it line, so everyone knows where they stand. I guess that's what part two is. I would like to push back a little bit on the sentience thing. I think I did say to you before about, I'm not sure sentience is actually the most appropriate word, because I think a lot of what you described is more, I certainly would call it more competence than sentience. The problem, I think sentience is a bit of a problematic word to use, because there's a bit of a crossover when it comes to understanding. And I know what you're saying about children with regards to, even if we don't consider them sentient at their current age, they obviously have the capacity to grow into what you would call a sentient being. I'm not actually sure if you're saying whether children are sentient or not, actually. Do you want to clarify that? Sorry.
So it goes to my definition of sentience: able to understand, able to think in concepts, and able to set goals and plan your actions to meet them. Certainly, newborns are completely incapable of that, and at some point between probably this is not to reintroduce the continuum problem, because we have an objective definition of when it happens. When a child is able to begin thinking in concepts, and when a child is able to set goals and plan how to best achieve them, we have crossed the line into sentience, or what you would call competence. Like I picked sentience because I just thought that was the most apt word. I mean, I don't think there is a word that means exactly what I mean when I say sentience. That's why I define it every time I bring it up, right? Sure, yeah. I mean, I don't want to get caught up on word definitions anyway. I'm quite happy to use whatever definition you apply. I suppose for me, the way I've understood sentience is a child is sentient pretty much from day one, from how I define sentience, but competence comes later. That's why I feel like competence is a better word, because that's more, it's like with the whole consent thing. The reason why children can't consent, in my view, is because they lack the competency to understand what they're consenting to, which invalidates the consent. The problem with sentience is that I think that's something, like I said, I don't think that necessarily includes competence. And also there's a big crossover, like, for example, a lot of animals have greater cognitive capacity than children up to a certain age. An adult pig, for example, is more intelligent than your average child below the age of 2 or 3, varying, but from child to child and from pig to pig, I'd imagine. But again, and I don't know exactly the age ranges, but I think like chimpanzees are sort of equivalent to an 8 or 9 year old, or perhaps even older than that. I think gorillas are around sort of 5 or 6 in comparative, cognitive ability and what have you. And even if you've sort of said that, well, you can exclude children from that conversation because of the potential to become sentient, then what do you do about people that have got mental handicaps that are always going to be the case? They're never going to achieve that level. So I do think it becomes a little bit problematic just in the way you're defining. I don't think it does, and I'll take a hardline stance on it, and offer myself to you as a sacrificial lamb if you want to try and disassemble my position. The mentally incompetent person, let's say, would not look, if you can't. I don't know if I had this. I've had so many conversations lately. This is awesome. I'm forgetting who I've said what to. So So if I'm repeating myself to you, please forgive me. If you cannot conceptualize property, and if you cannot conceptualize ownership, then you can't own property. Property is a state of understanding ownership and understanding the right and capability and capacity to control who is and isn't allowed to use something. That's what ownership is. If you can't conceptualize that, then you can't own property. So if you are handicapped to the point of being unable to understand property, then you can't be said to have ownership of anything, even self-ownership. And I know that we're back into kind of, I don't know, a dangerous territory that might trigger people. But if I'm wrong, tell me how I'm wrong and back it up. But all that means is it doesn't mean that, we go around killing mentally handicapped people. It just means that whoever is taking care of them has taken responsibility for their body property on their behalf, let's say. And that's totally fine and acceptable. But to say that to say that those that can't even understand property or ownership have ownership would mean it would just be untenable. Like you would not be able to do anything to them without their consent, but they can't give you their consent because they don't even understand what you're needing from them.
I understand where you're coming from, and I do actually agree with what you're saying. That's not necessarily the area where I'm sort of pushing back, because no, I fully agree with that. But just to clarify, do you think the non-aggression principle applies to them in any way?
I haven't thought about this too in depth yet. So, give me an example, I guess.
Okay, well, let me just tell you the way I see it, and then we can sort of see where we disagree on this. Because basically, my attitude with regards to whether it's children or mentally handicapped adults, those that don't have the competency, as I would say it, to understand property rights, they can't own things, and they don't have the full self-ownership, which is why they can't consent to sex, drugs, and contracts, and all the rest of it. They can't understand property rights, therefore they can't own property, and that's perfectly fine. And I will extend that to self-ownership to a certain degree. For people like that, from a child and a mentally handicapped adult, they're not fully emancipated by the non-aggression principle in the sense that they don't have the self-ownership and the freedom that comes with that. They also don't have the responsibility, which means they wouldn't be criminally responsible if they done something. Whoever's looking after them would be, whoever's their guardian. Now, the one distinction I like to make, I don't know if you'd agree with this or not, but I don't consider children to be their parents' property. I consider the children to the parents are their guardians, not their owners. The reason why the parents are their guardians is because they have a duty of care over their children, because they brought them into peril when they brought them into this world, which is why they have a duty to care for them until they're old enough to care for themselves, until they have got that competency or sentience, as you would put it, to take that responsibility for themselves. So it's not an ownership issue. So even though the child doesn't have full self-ownership in the sense of being able to take those decisions for themselves, and a guardian would have to do it on their behalf, the guardian wouldn't be able to treat them like property in the way that they'd be able to a car. Basically they wouldn't be property in any way. They would have a responsibility of care for them. And I suppose one of the reasons why I push back on the sentience thing is because the reason why I don't want to use it for what I would call competence is because I still want that word to describe all. Like I basically, for me, a child is sentient from day one, but becomes competent at a certain stage, which we've already discussed is defined by their understanding of property rights and what have you. So that's why I suppose I push back a bit on the sentience thing, because for me it means a slightly different thing. But
okay, well, for the purposes of the rest of this discussion, then I will say that my two-part definition of sentience will now be thus forward here referred to as woke. So once you're woke, once you're woke or will be woke, the nap applies to you. Does that help?
Yes. Yeah. It does. Yeah. I mean, I'm like I said, I'm not. I'm quite happy to use your definition anyway. But it was just to describe where I'm coming from.
Well, yeah. If you're using it differently, then we need to clarify so that we're not talking in circles around each other. Yeah. So
exactly. Yeah. So
I agree with you that children
Sorry, go on.
I think by my definition of who gets rights, who does the NAP apply to, and this is the best definition I found that is universalizable, and I'm challenging everyone in the entire world to come up with a better one, is anyone who will be woke, who is woke or will be woke, gets the benefit of the reciprocal understanding of the non-aggression principle. That means that from the moment, the gametes meet, you have an entity that will be woke one day. I like woke. I think I'm going to start using that instead of substance. So
What about the mentally handicapped that never will be?
So the child always has the reciprocal understanding of mutual ownership of the non-aggression principle. They have a body property right, a right to not have their body property controlled or aggressed against from the very beginning. So parents, and I forgot what word you used, that parents are to their children. Guardian. I prefer, and again, this is another word preference, but I think these are important. That's why I'm, talking through them with you. I think custodian is a better word. You're a custodian of somebody else's property until which point they can regain control of that property. I think that's the best description for a parent.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, I see where you're coming from, because it's like you're not taking ownership. Like you say, you're just taking custody until they can take it back, sort of thing. Like if I was custodian over your house while you're away, it's not mine, but I'm just basically in charge of it until you can get back and be in charge of it again.
Yeah, and I make the analogy of, you're walking down the street and you find a Rolex, a $100,000 Rolex on the ground. You pick it up. You know that you can reasonably understand that whoever this belongs to didn't just discard it. It's probably lost, and it is definitely owned by somebody, even if it's the manufacturer. So you're in possession of, you're a custodian of somebody else's property. And if you choose to retain that property, I think you need to act on that property or act with that property in the way that you would most reasonably expect its rightful owner to want you to, which would be, try and find somebody that can return it to them, or try and locate the original owner, or at least, protect it and not try and damage it, because you would expect that its owner would want you to behave that way towards it. I think the same types of arguments can be made even stronger for children, because children are a chosen obligation, whereas a watch on the ground is not necessarily an obligation that you would take for yourself. So you choose to create a kid, you have an obligation to be a good custodian of that person's property, until which time they can take possession, full ownership. I guess I hate saying full ownership, because that implies that you can have, it's like a spectrum. And I try and get rid of spectrums, because I don't think that's valid. I think they always have full, complete ownership of it, but I think the parent's responsibility is to the future adult self of that child to deliver them their property in the best condition possible. And I think that obligation is chosen by the parent when they choose to create a life.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. And I think, to be honest, you've won me round with regards to the use of the word custodian, because I think that does sum it up better. And I think it's an important distinction to make as well, because the important thing you can draw from that is, even if a child isn't fully emancipated, freed by the non-aggression principle, at that stage, they will be later. Even though they're not, they're still protected by it with regards to harm to them and stuff like. So I think that's important, because otherwise, that's why with the non-aggression principle, when it comes to children, it's not necessarily all or nothing. Yeah, they don't have, I know full self-ownership isn't an ideal term, but we both know what we're saying with that. They don't have that they don't have the moral agency to be able to make these decisions for themselves and consent and what have you, but they're still protected by the non-aggression principle.
They're asleep. They're asleep. That's why I use that analogy of will be sentient, because in the same way that I'm not able to, we both agree, because remember, these are all just reciprocal agreements. We both agree that when you're asleep, I don't get to walk in and homestead your house and property. You will be sentient again in the near future. You need to be afforded rights, or the reciprocal respect of the non-aggression principle.
Yeah, like I said, the only problem I do see that with regards to if it's dependent on the caveat of that you will be, is what about those that won't be, with regards to, you know, someone that's got a mental handicap that they're never going to grow out of, for example. I suppose that's the only reason why I perhaps didn't approach it from that exact perspective, although we're kind of saying the same thing in a way, just coming at it from ever so slightly different perspectives.
Well, I think it's an incredibly uncomfortable conversation to have. It's along the same lines as it's down there with age of consent. It's like we're discussing something that, you know, is potentially very disgusting and a sensitive topic, but you know, there are humans, human lives that are so handicapped to the point where there isn't even consciousness there. And so ethically, they can't exist in the realm of ethics, because they can't even conceive of existing, much less mutual understandings between people for how they're going to interact with one another.
But I would still argue that they would need to be protected by the non-aggression principle, because they can still, like, I suppose the way I see the non-aggression principle, because I suppose I don't tie it 100% to ownership with regards to like property rights or what have you. I mean, I feel like the non-aggression principle gives birth to property rights rather than the other way around. And for me, the non-aggression principle is about causing harm or loss to another. So the child or the mentally handicapped person, for me, it's not dependent on them someday becoming sentient. The non-aggression principle still protects them from harm or loss, but it doesn't give them the full emancipation, the full self-ownership where they can make the decisions, because they can't make those decisions. So, for example, the argument works with regards to saying that these people, whether it's children or mentally handicapped adults, they can't own themselves in that way. They can't make these decisions. They can't consent to this and that because they lack the understanding for the reciprocal agreement that you're talking about. But I don't think the non-aggression principle only applies to people that can make that reciprocal agreement. I think the protection of the non-aggression principle would still apply even without that, but the freedom that you have, the self-ownership, if you like, the self-determination, perhaps even a better word, is something that it doesn't give you until you're at a stage where you do possess the moral agency to be able to reciprocate.
While I would agree that it is such a dangerous thing to talk about removing rights from an entity, or not removing, but just not reciprocating rights with an entity, that you would certainly err far on the side of the benefit of the doubt with people that are in and around the line of is or is not woke. I'm liking this word, it's growing on me. I agree that it's not like I'm talking about some like new eugenics platform for, you know, ridding the world of these self-owning, you know, lives out there. That's not what I'm saying at all. But you have to have a line. It has to exist. Otherwise, you have to afford the non-aggression principle to all forms of life. You have to have a universalizable definition of who it applies to.
And
doesn't apply
to my ears, you've just made the case for my part 2 of my agreement.
What?
Because you have to have that line. Because you said you have to have that line, and that's what.
But the line has to be objective and not subjective. It can't just be, you know, your opinion. It needs to be objective and universalizable.
Well, that's one of the things I don't feel like I communicated very well before when I spoke about part 2, because you were talking about like standards. I think you were thinking of it more as the sort of standards, like, for example, the standards I agreed to being part of a homeowners association or a tenants agreement or any kind of voluntary collective. These sort of standards, yeah, they can only apply to people that agree to them ahead of time. What I'm talking about with part 2 is drawing the line where we're saying, no, you're definitely violating the non-aggression principle there.
Okay, well,
I mean, like I say, I know
the reason why I objected, the reason why I saw a problem there was because you used an example of age of consent and you said it's probably between this age and this age. That's an arbitrary subjective opinion. That collectivizes necessarily all the children into one group called children and puts an age under which they are not sentient. But there are exceptions. There are, you know, really young people. I see we're getting into this topic that we don't talk about. There are younger people that probably meet the, you know, there. I bet you. I think it's relatively safe to say, especially, God, I hate talking about this. So like it is, in some states, you are not considered an adult. You're not considered of the age of reason at 17. I know for a fact there are 17-year-olds that would meet my definition of sentience. That are fully woke, and that they're fully, they have their self-agency and they can make decisions for themselves. They might make dumb ones, but making dumb decisions is part of being human sometimes.
Well, that is why I added the caveat of competency as well. Like I said, it wouldn't just be down to age. I suppose the reason why I like to use the age of consent example, I know it's an uncomfortable subject in many ways, but I just feel like to describe what I'm talking about, it's easier for people listening to me. It's easier to visualize using the numbers of an age range. And then I can sort of talk about, like 16, 17, people can reasonably disagree. And yeah, I would add the caveat that I think, a competency test or something like that would also need to be involved. It wouldn't just be down to age on its own. But
I think it can't involve age at all.
Age and,
because to apply an age is to collectivize. And the moment you collectivize, the moment you're going to have exceptions that then would enable you to aggress against innocent people that are woke.
Well, I mean, I still think age could at least come into it to a certain degree. But even let's say, again, even if you're right and that's not what it is, and we put it purely on the competency test, again, that's still a line that needs to be drawn. Like I say, whichever way. It was the same with the doorbell thing. It was like, even when I was going through it in my head, and it wasn't something I was 100% on. I was thinking to myself, well, I still think that, but then I think, do you know what? If we created a free society and the line was drawn on the other side of that, where you're saying it should be, I could live with that. But it also made me realize that even if the line needs to be drawn where you're saying it needs to be drawn, it still demonstrates the need to draw a line. And even if it's not drawn based on age, like I say, I just use age because it's easier to visualize with numbers. But it's like with homesteading, for example. Let's put it this way. Like, say you're going to homestead and you're going to build a house, and most people understand that you don't just have dominion over the land that sits directly underneath your house. You've also got dominion over an area around that, your garden area and what have you. But if, say, you lived on the edge of the Brazilian rainforest and you built a house there, you can't say that the entire Brazilian rainforest is your garden. So do you see what I'm saying? There's a line that needs to be drawn, because otherwise people will push interpretations into the realms of absurdity. And if we don't draw a line where we say, like I say, it can't be a subjective line. It's got to be a line where we're saying, okay, now you're definitely stepping over the line there. I just think there's some areas where people can agree to disagree, and maybe age of consent isn't the best example, but like homesteading would be another example. How do you decide how big your garden can be? Or how much labor you can put into homestead?
If you're using the property, if you're using the property, you're homesteading it. If you're not using it, you're not. Use is a pretty clearly defined term. There is no. So I guess what I'm saying is, if your number two is just objective, universalizable clarifications of the non-aggression principle, then I don't really disagree with you. But if it is trying to set subjective, arbitrary lines on continuum problems, then I don't think that you are ethically justified in forcing your opinions on other people.
Well, I'm not just saying this so you'll agree to me, but it is more the former. It is.
No, that's awesome.
That's why I see it anyway.
That's good.
That is the way I see it. Yeah, and that's one of the things I don't think I explained before. I think I made it sound more like the latter, of it being like these arbitrary distinctions. Right. I suppose that's the reason why I invoked age of consent, because then I could use like, but this age range, people can agree to disagree, but here we're saying definitely not and what have you. And maybe I need to rethink whether I should even talk about age, and maybe it should just be fully down to competency. But like I said, I just like that because it was numbers, and it's so much easier for people to visualize. You start talking about other areas. But again, like I say, I suppose the way I'm looking at it is like, when people have agreed to the non-aggression principle, then as long as they understand the non-aggression principle, which would obviously have to be defined for them to agree to it, then kind of that's that in that sense. But I just feel like there's still going to be these areas where people are going to say, well, yeah, but the line needs to be drawn here or the line needs to be drawn there. And I'm like, well, these are subjective, and we can't enforce these little lines here, because I can't say 100% that that's the case or that's the case. But I can say that you can't go any further than this line. And maybe it would just be one line. Maybe it's just a case of, perhaps in a way, these three parts of this peace agreement could just be one agreement. But I suppose I'm kind of looking at people, and even without intellectual dishonesty, even with all full good intentions, people are going to differ on interpretation. So I just feel like even if the line that can be drawn is 100% objective, and we can find it if we try, I think it still needs to be drawn so people know ahead of time, this is where we stand. This is where we draw the line. The non-aggression principle should tell you that. And I agree, it should tell people that. But it doesn't in so many people's minds. So I suppose it is just adding that extra clarification. And the same with the property rights. The non-aggression principle tells you what's rightful ownership. We understand that already. We understand voluntary trade or creation, which is kind of what homesteading's about. We understand that's how you acquire rightful ownership. We do get that, but I still think we need to declare that's his, this is mine. I do still think we need that, even if the principle's already been agreed ahead of time. I just think if we agree the principle first, and that's why the order of the part 1, 2, 3 is so important, because 2 and 3, you can't even have the conversation until you've got part 1. You need to agree on the principle, and then you can establish who owns what, and then you can establish where we're drawing the lines in the sand, where we will use force, because you're definitely violating the non-aggression principle. So I guess it's something that, in theory, should only need to be one part. It should just be about establishing the non-aggression principles law. But I guess I just feel that putting it into the real world, we need to divide it into 3 parts of making the basic agreement, and then drawing the lines of our limits of tolerance, saying, no, this is definitely violating the non-aggression principle, and as I say, and just clarifying this is rightful ownership.
You know what?
And
I think we're at a good place to end this talk on, and we can certainly have more talks in the future. I think the word that triggers me every time you say it is our. When you say our limits on interpretation. I think if you said the limits, the objective limits, that it would stop triggering me, because when you say our, that's like this collectivist word that, is determined democratically and agreed upon by 50% plus one of the group, like that. I think that's what my irritation.
I understand what you're saying with that. Yeah, I mean, to be honest, this is the flaw with language. It'd be much easier if we could just telepathically tell each other what we're trying to say, rather than using because that is the problem with language. We don't always come from the same. And I know
I'm annoying about I know I'm annoyingly precise with language. I know, but I think that's necessary for this profession that we are currently engaged in. I think that's necessary.
It is important because you need to define terms. Otherwise, like you say, we're just going to talk past each other. And also, I think it helps us understand what we're saying, because where we've thrashed out our definitions on that, it helps us understand. I understand what you mean by sentience, whereas before I might have been like, well, my dog's sentient, do you see what I mean? So now I'm like, but they can't understand a legal contract, or, so it's like, so I understand what you're saying. And I think it's important to define words, because even if we're using different definitions, if we're all approaching our conversations with good faith, then we can get past that, because we can discuss and break down what we're trying to say. So,
agreed.
So it's important. It's an important thing to do. So don't be deterred from it. Keep going with the distinction, because I think it is important to.
Yes, to embrace the annoying precision. So thanks for coming on for a talk. I like having these talks publicly, because other people can benefit from them, instead of just me and you, or me and the one other person I'm talking to. So I appreciate, because not everybody's willing to put their face behind their philosophical convictions. So I appreciate your willingness to do so. Can you direct people to where they can find out more about what you're doing?
The website's nationsofsanity.com. There's a Twitter and a Facebook page of the same name, and a YouTube channel of the same name. The YouTube channel is pretty early. There's only a few videos on there at the moment. It's mainly just written articles, but I'm going to try and add a lot more video content, because that's a little bit more easier for people to digest, I think. So
All right. Awesome, sir. I appreciate you coming on. The last thing I'll shout out to people, I'm probably going to do a separate video officially announcing this, but just as a sneak peek for anybody that made it to the end of this video, I have recently completed recording and mastering the audiobook for Unschool Yourself First. It's a book by Mark Beaumont on how to unschool your children, how to get them out of the Prussian schooling system that pretty much the entire Western world is involved in. And to school them yourself in a voluntarist paradigm. So that audiobook has been completed and mastered and is about to be published. And I have awesomely received permission from Mark Beaumont to offer that entire audiobook to our upper level Patreon supporters for free. So there's going to be a real benefit for the upper tier, $20, I think, and above Patreon supporters. So please check out our Patreon and you will have some cool audiobook content to review on unschooling. Thanks for watching.